Yes. Yeah, you did it before. Yeah, I get it. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much. And good evening also to our audience on Zoom. Or is it afternoon, evening? I never know what to say at 5 o'clock. So thank you all so much for joining us here in person and remotely. The Los Altos History Museum respectfully acknowledges the Ohlone people whose ancestral homelands San Francisco Bay once was. We are grateful for the living descendants and the leadership of the Muwekma Ohlone who have sent us their greetings. We sit on the traditional homelands and we are grateful for their support. I am Dr. Elizabeth Ward, the museum's executive director. and I can no longer read with my glasses on. I'm sorry. I was like trying to do that with my glasses off. I'm sorry. So that was tough. So I'm the museum's executive director, and I'm so honored to be here with all of you to have this conversation with you here this evening. Thank you for being here, both on Zoom and here at the museum. This is our first in-person event, and we might not have another one for a while. So I'm grateful that all of you are here with us this evening. Thank you so much. And thank you for supporting the museum. I'm going to try to go to the next slide. If I can figure out how to do that. Next slide. Okay, sorry. Technical glitches. Next slide is not these arrow keys. Okay, I'm just looking for the, where did it go? Where did it go? That one, that's the one, there we go. So tonight's program is in support of the exhibition that is here in our Changing Exhibition Gallery, Gold Fever, Untold Stories of the California Gold Rush. This is a special traveling exhibition organized by Exhibit Envoy in partnership with the California Humanities and the Oakland Museum of California. It was mounted here by our incredible exhibits committee led by Eleanor Watanabe, who is hiding back there and who has also brought us some hospitality this evening. When the program is over here, and for those of you on Zoom, I'm sorry you won't be able to enjoy it. When the program's over, we can open up the curtains, and if people want to sort of mill around outside, we can do that. So Eleanor has been an incredible chair to our exhibits committee. She has on her team Carrie Castro, Pat Hedden, Judy Hooper, who's here with us, Diane Simmons, Nikki Andrews, and our designer, Jan Davis, a new volunteer, Anna Wu. We're very grateful for all of their support and for executing the vision for this exhibition without the support of our staff exhibit curator, Amy Ellison, who has gone on to other projects. So like so many things here at the museum, our Changing Exhibits program depends on the support of our amazing members and volunteers. If you are not already a member, please consider becoming one, or if you'd like to get involved as a volunteer, we have a lot of fun volunteer opportunities here. This exhibit will be displayed for a few more weeks. It is closing August 29th. We are open here Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, noon to 4. We're always free admission, so you can come back with family and friends. When it leaves here, it is going to Park City, Utah, where many of you might know the golden spike was laid when the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. The storied history of that moment is something I expect we will be touching on here this evening. We are so delighted and honored that Connie Young Yu has joined us. She has done so much to correct the historic record regarding Chinese role in American history. To tell you more about tonight's program and about our speaker, I'd like to ask my colleague, Diane Shen, to join me at the podium. Diane is the museum's collection strategist, and she has been spearheading our social justice archive. I am grateful for her dedication to telling diverse stories here at the Los Altos History Museum. Diane?
Awesome. Thank you, Elizabeth, for such a kind introduction. And thank you to all of our audience members here in person and on Zoom, our Zoom attendees joining us from home. It's really hard to believe that it's already been over a year and a half since we've gathered in the gallery for an exhibition program. So I'd like to welcome old friends back and of course, welcome new friends for the first time and express our sincere gratitude for joining us for such a special and timely event. Before we jump into the program, I'd like to briefly just go over tonight's schedule since this is a hybrid program. So let's just keep our fingers crossed that the technology works out okay. So we're going to go ahead and begin the lecture at about 6:10 p.m. We might be a little bit behind schedule. Immediately concluding the talk around 7:15, we're going to jump into a live Q&A. So we will ask members of the audience to go ahead and ask any questions over to Connie. And for our Zoom attendees at home, please feel free to submit your questions into the Q&A chat box throughout the program, and we'll be monitoring that during the talk. Exhibitions have an enormous power to transport ourselves into another time in history. And tonight, as we gather in this space, we dig deeper to learn about the lives of early Chinese pioneers in California. It is my greatest hope that this presentation reminds us that even if the stories of the Chinese diaspora may not seem to be directly tied to our lives, it actually is tied to every single one of us. An experience that is solely not mine is still a thread that makes up the fabric of our society and ultimately the world that we occupy together. And it's from this understanding that it's vital that we listen to human stories so that we become kinder to one another. This pandemic has allowed us to rethink our public lives, our routines, and perhaps much more of a mindful awareness of our societal structures. The pandemic has also questioned the deeper racial consciousness in this country, as well as around the world. With the increasing rise in anti-Asian violence in the United States, and in particular here, right here at home in the Bay Area, this program is extremely vital and necessary. I feel very privileged to share the stage in solidarity and introduce a historian whose brave work has allowed many Asian Americans to feel seen and be heard. Fourth generation Californian, Connie Young Yu is a documentarian of Asian American history. She draws on the experiences of her pioneer ancestors in her work, such as the book Chinatown, San Jose, USA, and documentary videos, notably Digging to Chinatown and Detained at Liberty's Door. Connie represented descendants at the honoring of the Chinese railroad workers by the Department of Labor in Washington, D.C. in 2014. She was the commencement speaker at the celebration of the 150th anniversary of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad at Promontory, Utah in 2019. She most recently appeared in the PBS documentary series, Asian Americans, released last year, which was just awarded a Peabody Award this year. As a community activist, Connie was a member of the citizens group which saved the detention barracks on Angel Island, resulting in the designation of the Angel Island Immigration Station as the National Historic Landmark. She is the board member emeritus of the Chinese Historical Society of America, a trustee of Hakone Foundation, and the co-author of the new Arcadia book, Hakone Estates and Gardens. Please join me in welcoming Connie Young Yu.
What an introduction. Thank you, Diane. And thank you, Dr. Elizabeth Ward, for inviting me to give this talk in the first place. And I loved what you said about the heritage of this building and the site. I have to share with you, I went to public schools in San Francisco, and even in the 50s, fourth grade was California history. I didn't know anything about the Chinese in California, but I certainly learned a lot about Father Sarah because we had to create a paper mache map of California, paper mache. And we had to save our popsicle sticks to, make crosses for the 21 crosses of Father Sarah's mission. And our field trip was to visit Mission Dolores. Now, that kind of activity just stayed in our minds. I mean, we just didn't get it out of our heads. I don't think I remembered anything about California becoming a state, but I certainly remember, the subjugation of California Native Indigenous people by Father Sarah, only it was called missionary work and Christianizing them. But anyway, I really did enjoy making the map, I must tell you. Paper mache is fun. But, anyway, so it's been a kind of a journey, a long but wonderful lived journey to find my roots. And I owe so much of this to my parents and my grandparents who kept the tradition of oral history. So you're going to hear a lot of things you haven't heard in or seen in history books or textbooks, but it's stories that have been passed down, people's stories. And this is why I am a historian. I mean, I don't have a graduate degree in history or anything, but I just kept on the search and motivated largely by the fact that there's this omission. And it started, of course, with the centennial of the railroad, where Chinese were omitted from the ceremonies. And you probably know that story, but my parents went with Phil Choi to Promontory, May 10th, 1969, to present a plaque in commemoration of Chinese railroad workers. And at the last minute, and Phil Choi was invited. He even had a telegram saying, Mr. Choi, president of the Chinese Historical Society, we would like you to give a presentation of the plaque, you know. And at the last minute, when 20,000 people are there, gathered there, there's a grandstand, the organizer of the event, Mr. Goodfellow, went up to Phil Choi and said, I'm sorry, Mr. Choi, there's no time for you. And that moment was lost, and it started a movement, I'll tell you that. And I'm part of that for 50 years. And finally, I felt that something was accomplished, by the descendants going to a promontory for the 150th. Some of you are here and out there on Zoom. Some of the descendants of Chinese railroad workers journeyed to promontory to make sure that their presence was known, and the contributions of Chinese railroad workers in building America, the infrastructure of America, would never be forgotten. So I very fortunately, because of the pressure from the Chinese community and the Chinese Historical Society, was selected to be the commencement speaker. And even up to the last minute, I expected somebody to come up to me and say, sorry, Ms. Yu, there's no time for you. Just that paranoia or that anxiety, because of the past record of how we have been excluded. Minority people have been excluded. People of color have been excluded from history. Anyway, I would like to just proceed with my reclaiming the history of the Chinese in gold mining, but also the history thereafter. What was started by the Chinese coming to Gold Mountain. So you see the title of my talk, Journey to Gold Mountain, and the Chinese words, which so many of you can read. It's on the left is Gum San, Gold Mountain. This was the name given to America, the Western portion certainly, by Chinese in China coming for the gold rush. As soon as the word that there was gold in this area, Yerba Buena area or Calafia, or what else was the name for California? But, in Canton, they go, oh, Gold Mountain, the dream began. As soon as the word reached, the gold was discovered, as you will know from the exhibit, in January 1849, but the word did not get out for another year. But in Canton, Chinese heard about the gold being found in Sutter's Mill before many areas of the East Coast. So the word was Gamsan, and to me, I grew up as a child hearing it. My grandparents were talking to people, I came to Gamsan this year, or when did you come to Gamsan? It was always like that for America. The earlier word, the word before Gamsan for America was fake, flower flag. So, and the reason why they're all of the newcomers for the gold rush that were from China were from southern China. They're all Cantonese. And Canton was the only port open to the West until 1784. And so there was always this contact between Canton and the West. So this is a painting by Jake Lee. It's one of 12 of these legacy paintings of Chinese pioneer life that hung in the Gumsan room of Can's restaurant in the which opened in 1953. And I guess in 59, Jake Lee was commissioned by Johnny Can and his partners to create a legacy that would give us pride and joy about our Chinese, contributions to America, and also, the fact that we've been here so long. And so he was commissioned to create these paintings. And this is miners in the mother lode. So these paintings were put up probably 1960. My father was a partner of Johnny Can, so I saw these paintings go up. The moment I was so proud and so excited. It's the first time I ever saw paintings about Chinese, in America, that they were part of the landscape. So this is, and it wasn't just California. There's South Dakota, the Chinese winning a fire hose race in Deadwood, South Dakota. And then there's a shoe manufacturing scene showing Chinese making boots in Massachusetts. And of course, the Chinese working on the railroad, the wonderful picture of Cape Horn in Nevada. Okay, this is miners in mother lode country. And you can see it's sort of a composite picture where it shows Chinese in different activities. The panning for gold is the first scene, and that's how they got gold in many other methods. But panning was just to see if there's flakes in the water. And the Chinese had this method of damming the river, and they used the water wheel. But most of their activity was in placer mining using the rocker method. But anyway, I'll just read you from a book, a syllabus created by the Chinese Historical Society of America by Phil Choi, Mark Lai, and Thomas Chin. And when it was published in 1969, we thought this was the only first book written by Chinese Americans that was factual about the Chinese in California and all of their activities and their contributions and the laws against them and how they survived. So let's see, here's the second, there's another picture by Jake Lee. And I love this scene. It's very vibrant, exciting. And it's immigrants disembarking the ship. And you see them coming down and there's this on the gangplank, there's a Chinese person stumbling under the weight of a big burden and a friend trying to help him. And then you see down below, there's people sorting out their baggage and people coming to meet them. So this is the first big wave. And I would say this picture would be like would portray Chinese coming in 1852. That's when 20,000 Chinese came because of the gold rush. There were Chinese here before, I wanted to say, before the gold rush. There were some Chinese stores, a few, not very many that were recorded, but the Chinese were here. And there was a Chinese fishing village also. But it was really the gold rush that brought them here. And many of the merchants came because they realized that was going to be their livelihood, the business. You're not going to make money in the mines. You're going to make money selling things to the miners and providing services. So let's see, after landing in San Francisco, several days were spent procuring necessary supplies and consulting one another of the district's associations. Then the immigrants would set off in the company of his fellow countrymen headed for gold mining districts. From San Francisco, the group usually traveled by water to Stockton if they were going to the southern mines, or on the tributaries of the San Joaquin, or via Sacramento for the northern mines on the American River. If the Chinese wished to try their luck at the northern mines on the Feather and Yuba rivers, they proceeded further up the Sacramento River to Marysville. The Chinese also appeared on the scene when gold was discovered in Trinity County area in the early 1850s. In 1853, they first appeared in Shasta County on their way to new mines. So they would go wherever they thought they could strike gold. So Jake Lee did a lot of research, as you can see from the painting, and this might be one of the photographs he studied. He also traveled for 2 years before painting these pictures. He traveled throughout the United States to sites where Chinese had gone and settled. So this shows the Chinese mining in the 1890s, because the Chinese were generally, I guess they were driven out of the mines by the mid 1850s. Driven out meaning they had to keep moving on. They had to move on. That the white miners would come and jump their claims or take over the richer areas. So they would move on to another area, and then another and another. And finally, they'd be working on the tailings of the places where the white miners were. So anyway, this is from Canton Footsteps by Phil Choi, this photograph, and he indicated that that mining did continue, that there was still that dream of Gold Mountain, that you could strike it rich, that gold could, the mineral would come from the soil and it could be yours. So of course the world rushed in after the gold was found in Sutter's Mill and the word got out. San Francisco Harbor in the 1850s was crowded with ships abandoned by seamen heading for the gold country. There were whaling ships, and people just, the sailors, it's a hard life being a whaler. They just leave here. They got to San Francisco. Is there a comment? Anyway, I mean, there's so many ships. There are hundreds of ships abandoned, and it's kind of remarkable. This, let's see, I had a note of this drawing. It's not a photograph, it looks like one. This drawing was done by Daniel Gott, who's a Connecticut businessman who came also to see the elephant for the gold rush. He came in 1849 in April, and I guess he drew it afterwards. And let's see, there were 380 ships in the harbor in October 49, 635 ships 7 months later. They were abandoned. So what happens to all these ships? They'd just be sitting there. So in the 1850s, they'd be sitting there. San Francisco needed lumber. And so by this time, a lot of Chinese they realized that they're going to mining was really hard. They came back, and the word was out also to Canton to keep coming, because good wages in Gumsan, that you can earn a living, you can really make money. I mean, people would pay for your work. I mean, this was very exciting for the poor villagers, for the people in the cities who just were destitute. So anyway, so the Chinese came as laborers, another wave, and they were hired by the new city to take apart these ships and get the lumber for building the sidewalks and the buildings and the roads of San Francisco. And I found some testimony at the Bancroft, and it just had a little page and it said, I see gangs of Chinamen, breaking up boards, just that vivid image. So, and again, this is not exactly that well known, but here it is, it's there if you look for it. The history is there. You just have to really research. You go to the California Historical Society, look for old photographs, go to the Bancroft, and historical societies everywhere. Okay, early California legislation against Chinese. 1850, as soon as California becomes a state, they're going to enact this law, foreign miners tax. And of course, it was supposed to be for all foreigners, including Chileans, Hawaiians, French, but it was really aimed at Chinese because the Chinese were the most visible, and they were there, and there are so many of them on rich claims, and they were vulnerable. It was set at $20 a month, but it drove out the Chinese. I mean, $20 a month. Reduced in 1852 to $4 a month, raised to $6 a month in 1856. Tax collectors were allowed to keep a portion of the money for their fee, leading to fraud, violence, and murder against Chinese in mining camps. This established Chinese as foreigners in the new American scene. Mark Twain and Ruffingen wrote about the foreign miners tax, how there'd be bogus tax collectors just, preying on the Chinese, and beating them up if they didn't pay a tax. So this is California legislation. In 1854, Chinese were not allowed to testify in court. The 1850 law prohibiting Negroes and Indians from testifying for or against a white person was made applicable to Chinese by the decision of the California Supreme Court in the case of People versus Hall, 1854, which meant the Chinese had no civil rights. They were totally unprotected. This was not repealed until 1872. And I must say the Chinese did not take this passively. They had a district associations who could hire lawyers to appeal some of these laws. Some of them, sometimes they succeeded, mostly they did not. 1862, the police tax law was called the poll tax, required all Mongolians 18 years and older to pay a poll tax of $2.50 a month, unless they already paid a foreign miners tax or were engaged in the production of sugar, rice, coffee, or tea. This was, caused a great deal of hardship on the Chinese and left them open to, again, bogus collectors. This was later declared unconstitutional. The first federal legislation on immigration exclusion was in 1875, the Page Act. The stated purpose of this law was to prevent Chinese prostitutes from entering the United States, but it was used to exclude Chinese women. And during the gold rush, when the Chinese were driven out of the mines, they found other work, other business, they established themselves in small towns. There were tongs, and tong means haul, but they're the tongs that operated, they were trafficking in young girls. And this is a horrible, situation, a terrible, and it wasn't exactly documented. I heard most of this from my parents, my mother and my grandmother, who heard it from her grandmother, that Chinese to be beware, you're a young Chinese girl, you could be kidnapped, you could be sold into slavery. That was, every girl in Canton was told this by their parents, watch out, you could be kidnapped. And the poorest families did sell their daughters. They did sell their daughters. And they were bought by these traffickers and sold into slavery and brought over by ships and held in cages, and where they suffered, many of them died, were tossed overboard. These were stories I heard in my childhood, and I started to put everything together when I started studying the laws. So the Page Act was saying, there's Chinese prostitution. We're gonna have a law saying no Chinese women could come. That's it, no Chinese women, because they're heathen people. They're corrupt. They're gonna ruin our society. But it was really to exclude all Chinese women. And this was a way of the beginning of exclusion and crushing any possibility of a Chinese American society. Okay, back to California legislation. That was federal. 1879, the second California Constitution prohibited the employment of Chinese by any corporations, state, municipal, or county governments. The rising white labor movement used the Chinese as scapegoats, and the Chinese must go became the rallying cry throughout California. The political pressure from one state alone led to federal legislation, the Chinese Exclusion Act, passed by Congress, May 1882. So the pressure, as you see, and I think this is, the phrase Chinaman's chance, you don't have a Chinaman's chance, did not come from the railroads and Chinese being, hung over baskets to blast mountains. It came from the gold rush days. It came from the foreign miners tax, the poll tax, when the Chinese had no rights, they had no chance. So families, getting to families, how did we survive? How did our people survive? How did we make it? How could we have endured? Why are there descendants? Why am I here? Well, anyway, there's tenacity. There were some children actually born, in California in the 1860s. And I was I was coordinator for the Stanford's Chinese Railroad Workers Oral History Project. And I interviewed a lot of descendants, and the stories that they would tell me would be amazing. I interviewed one woman, she was in her 90s. She said her father was born in California and before the gold rush. And I go, really? She goes, yes, really, so anyway, but actually it was a single men society. By the exclusion law succeeded. It really did. And in 1880s, it was a bachelor society. People survived. Chinatowns did survive because, you have merchants, and merchants could bring over their wives. Merchants could have families. And so as far as my own family, my great-grandfather, Li Wangsang, came as a 19-year-old teenager to work on the Titlo, the Iron Road. He was hired by the Central Pacific, and he could speak a little English. He learned really quickly. I've seen his signature in English and heard the stories. But after the completion of the railroad, he was very fortunate. He went back to San Francisco and became a partner in a store that import and export things like dry shrimp and things like that. But he saved up enough money, he was able to send for his wife before the Page Act. And her name, Wong, was it? A Chin Shi, that means Mrs. Chin, that's her maiden name. But she came with two other women, and she told the story to my mother, as a little girl, that she was one of three women on a ship with all men. And they were in a little cabin by themselves, and they were terrified. And they heard horrible stories of what would happen to them and by white men who ate people. And I think they heard about the Donner Party. But that's what my mother said. They were so scared. But she met her husband, and she got along very well. Li Wangsang, my ancestor, I'm very proud to say, was a kind man of good character and took care of her, and also his daughter-in-law. And during the earthquake, that's another story. But they were in San Francisco during the earthquake, and I must say the earthquake was such an important, part, of course, for San Francisco and the world, but for the Chinese, it meant it was a possibility they'd be chased out of Chinatown. And so after, because the city was, they said, of all cities, Chinatown, this is the most enduring Chinatown. If we can get rid of this Chinatown, it'll be our fair city. But fortunately, the Chinese came back. Some of them owned the property. They would not be moved. And Chinatown became a much stronger city. It became Daifo, that despite all of the purges and all of the places that drove out the Chinese, they can always go back to Daifo, places in Tacoma, Washington, Seattle, Washington, Portland, if their homes would be burned and they would be chased out, they can go back to Daifo and regroup. So San Francisco was very important. Another thing was, of course, my grandfather risked his life during the earthquake to save his papers, the birth certificate, that he was born in the United States. That was so important to him, son of a railroad worker. And he ran back to the store. Meanwhile, Li Wangsang, his father, was taking care of my grandmother and her new baby, and they were making it to the wharf. Actually, they end up in the Presidio. My grandfather ran back to the store that soon would be blown up. And he got his papers, and he had this minop, a big heavy jacket, put his papers in there. And when he was coming out, a soldier, thinking he was a looter, just bayoneted him and stabbed him in the side. So he survived because he had all this padding, and he played dead. And, this is a story that I never told until the centennial of the earthquake, when people are telling stories. But my cousins and I, we would enact that scene as kids, but you didn't tell people things like that. I mean, white people, because they wouldn't understand. They'd say, well, maybe he was a looter, So anyway, that was a moment in our history, but it made me very proud of my family. They endured, and my great grandfather, the railroad worker, took care of the family. And so while his son was running off to save his papers, but it showed how important to show that you were born in the United States. But then, ironically, so many people later, Chinese who did not have papers, claimed that their papers were burned in the fire. So they were able to reinstate and my grandfather still had a lot of trouble going back and forth, proving that he was American, even though he had this paper. So I'd like to show you this book that I get a lot of information from old books, and I found this in a used bookstore 30 years ago. It's California, a book for travelers and settlers by Charles Nordhoff. And it was published in 1875, but it was written in early 1870s, which makes a big difference as far as what he observed, like the work of the railroads. So he was a wonderful observer from back east, and he's telling people what it's like to live in California, but he can't help having every chapter had the Chinese were mentioned. And he had one chapter called John, which is funny because my husband's name, but it's to be John Chinaman. That was the word for Chinaman because it was supposed to be more polite. The other word for Chinese was celestials. So he's describing very well what's happening to the Chinese in 1870. John now does most of the washing and ironing all over California. Wagung, Ali, or Fuklin, washing and ironing done with sometimes the additional button sewed on strong is in the sign. In the cities, he collects the garbage. He is cook. He's cook and waiter. He makes the cigars. He works in the woolen mills. Go into any manufacturing place and you will see his face. Then there is a Chinaman and a half on every mile of the Central Pacific Railroad. He raises 2/3 of the vegetables consumed in the state. He makes a good shepherd. In the farming districts, the commonest sight is to see John driving a wagon or plowing. The lonely ranchman keeps a Chinese cook. Hundreds of Chinese are going over the old mining slum, the old mother, the abandoned claims, and making money by this patient toil. He keeps his New Year's work with jollity and firecrackers from San Diego to Sacramento, and so far as Denver in Colorado, you see his sign, low wing, washing and ironing. Both political parties in California denounce the Chinese on their platforms, but if you go into the houses of these men who make the platforms, you will see Chinese servants. If you visit their farms or ranches, you will find Chinese hands. If you ask the political leader after dinner what he thinks, he will tell you that he could not get on without Chinese, and that the cry against them is the most abominable demagogism, all of which is true. So, okay, another chapter. This is chapter 19, the Chinese as railroad workers. So, okay. And he describes the Chinese working on their, this is after the Transcontinental Railroad. They're still building railroads. This is in 1970 and 1870. And he describes, how they get their supplies, how they survive. I think that this is not very well known, but okay. They buy their supplies at a store kept in several cars near the end of the track. This was during the Transcontinental Railroad too. And this shop was a great curiosity to me. Here's a list of the things that were kept and sold to the Chinese workmen: dried oysters, dried cuttlefish, dried fish, sweet rice crackers, dried bamboo sprouts, salted vegetables, Chinese sugar, 4 kinds of dried fruits, 5 kinds of desiccated vegetables, vermicelli, dried seaweed, Chinese bacon cut up into salt cutlets, dried meat of the abalone shell, peanut oil, dried mushrooms, tea, and rice. Sounds like what I get at Ranch 99. They also buy pork of the butcher, and on holidays they eat poultry. Compare this bill of fare with the beef, beans, bread and butter, and the potatoes of the white workers, the white laborers, and you will see that John has a much greater variety of food. Also, you should mention that the Chinese did not get sick from dysentery because they always boiled their water because they made tea, and whereas the white workers, they drank from the river and didn't boil their water. So unfortunately, they didn't become tea drinkers. So this is very interesting also that at the railroad store, they also kept pipes, bowls. They could sell pipes, bowls, chopsticks, large cast iron bowls for cooking rice, lamps, joss paper, Chinese writing paper, pencils, and Indian ink. And then Chinese shoes, clothing imported, ready-made from China. And then there's Chinese tobacco. The interesting thing is this. There's Chinese writing paper, pencils, and India inks. The Chinese could read and write. There's, the image that they were ignorant laborers was not true. And when I interviewed the descendants, one of them was very, she had such thoughts of, her ancestors who were laborers. And she said they could read and write. They went to village schools. Not all of them, of course, but the fact that they could sell writing paper, in these stores. Okay. This is a view near the state line, Truckee River. So of course they had photography then, but for the books, they had illustrators who did a pretty good job. Let's see. Talk about illustrators. This is a painting by a Wells Fargo officer named Aaron Stein, circa 1870, and sort of becomes sort of an icon for Wells Fargo, who, in we're talking about 2000, year 2000, they had a big campaign, which they said, serving the Chinese community since 1852. And it's true. So the Chinese, you see them riding backwards on the overland mail company. And they also, used the Wells Fargo for their banking, their mailing, their transporting of goods, and transporting gold. The total trust between the Chinese and Wells Fargo, because the Chinese had financial clout. The Wells Fargo published several directories in these between the 1870s and 1882. This is a directory of Chinese business houses. On the left, yeah, it's 1878. And I wanted to tell you that, okay, well, you can see the cities are the big one, San Francisco, the left, Sacramento, Marysville, very big town. Sacramento was called Yifo, meaning second city. Marysville was very large. Portland, Oregon, there's Stockton, sometimes called Samfo, third city. San Jose, which was very large. And then Virginia City, Nevada. Okay. In 1882, 2 cities were added. And this book was, again, this is the Directory of Principal Chinese Business Firms, 1882. The 2 cities were Oakland and Los Angeles. So San Francisco, and you see the words Gumsan, let's see, Jingfo. Thank you, friend. Yeah. Thank you, my friend Lee. She can read Chinese, so she's telling me over there. I got it right. That Jingfo means big city, main city. So we, in colloquial terms, I call it Daifo. They go, oh, we can always go back to Daifo. And that's San Francisco. So the listing is in alphabetical order. There's A Song Laundry, Ah Chong Clam Dealer, Ah Hing Laundry, Ah Jim Laundry. So there's a lot of Ahs for the A's, but they had, the Chinese name. So Sacramento, just wanted to give you an idea of the occupations you have. Wing Hop Laundry, Wing Sing Laundry, Wing Wu Laundry, Wu Ke Laundry, We Own Yu Ki Grocer, We Sing Vegetables, Yi Chin Lo Restaurant, Yi Hop Commission Merchant, Yi Hing Him Restaurant. Okay, San Jose, and these notes were, I did this like over 30 years ago when I got a copy of, I was so excited to get a copy of the Wells Fargo directory, Xerox copy from their archives, 1882. And I had to ask my mother, Mary Lee Young, to help me, interpret, what I was, because I was writing the book San Jose Chinatown. So San Jose, that's literally the sound. There's the mountain, and do mean a lot. Say, it's just phonetically, San Jose. And this was, it shows several Chinatowns, but I would say the main Chinatown was on Market Street, that big Chinatown, where the site of the Fairmont Hotel now. The Highlandville Chinatown, where my father was born, John Young, was started in 1887 after Market Street was burned. But anyway, let's look at what they have here. They have a barber, a Chinese mission. There was a Chinese mission. It was a Methodist Episcopal mission. Chong Hop Provisions, Choi Li Opium. Opium was not illegal until 1907. Chuck A, and this is it's a store, because they didn't say, I had to ask my mother, what is this? She said a store. And Chunky, again, opium. And then again, this is San Jose. We have a Pak Ying interpreter. We have a drugstore. We have another grocery merchandise. Let's see, bean curd tofu factory. They have a store. You have Guang Dukke merchandise. Dukke was a very big store in the Market Street, Chinatown. It moved to Heinleinville, and the Japanese Americans, when they first came, they were very grateful to Tuckey when they first came to Heinleinville, because there was no place else that would take them when they came in the 1890s. Tuckey was the first Chinese store, first store to give them credit so they could get established. So they were very grateful. I even saw one of the descendants show me a receipt from Tuckey for her, that was from her father. So that's sort of a side history, but it shows what San Jose was like, and this is not very well known. San Jose was a very large town, but it was a country, you know what it looks like. You go to Japantown, that's a site. So on Market Street, Chinatown was destroyed by arson fire, May 4th, 1887. And arson fire means it was set deliberately by anti-Chinese forces, because on March 8th, 1887, the city council already ordered the destruction of Chinatown on the grounds that it was a health hazard to the surrounding area. Before the council edict could be enacted, a fire broke out. It was just like Chinese were fair game, so destroying the entire settlement. My grandfather was there. He was 15 years old. He came to this Chinatown when he was 11 as a laborer, worked in a store, and then later went to making bricks and picking fruit and growing strawberries. So he was, I could think, outside the town when it burned, but when he came back, there was no home. He had no place to go. He went to San Francisco, where he worked in a hotel for several years before coming back to Heinleinville. This is a certificate of residence of my grandfather, Yonghua Gok. And this is a document that all Chinese had to carry because of the Gary Act 1892, by the provisions of the Gary Act. But when the act came out, it was to extend the Chinese exclusion law for another 10 years. And that meant the end. That meant the end of Chinese labor. It meant the end of Chinese in agriculture in Santa Clara County. So the Chinese were told by the Chinese Six Companies, which was a Chinese benevolent association, which was sort of the ruling body, for protection and for anyway, it was the Supreme Court for the Chinese. They told all of their people, do not register. This is civil disobedience. So you're going to do civil disobedience, do not register. So 2 of the Chinese were arrested. The case went to the Supreme Court. But the Chinese Six Companies levied a tax of $1, asked every person, like my grandfather, please pay $1. You have to pay $1 actually for the legal fees. And so it cost that much and so a tax was levied. They really thought they could win this one. The Chinese felt, okay, they're at a good position. The Supreme Court said, no, they lost in the Supreme Court. The Chinese had to register. And so that's why the law was 82, my grandfather, and practically all the ones I've seen, 1894. So that's my grandpa. And I knew him. He died when I was 10 years old, but I heard enough stories, wonderful stories. But also he had told me the Market Street Chinatown was set to drive us out. So that's oral history. So back to mining, the Chinese kept mining. They just, they would keep, there were people who would not give up this dream, and they would go to other places. They'd go upstream, wherever there were rivers, they'd head up to Oregon. And okay, on May 25th, 1887, this is just 20 days after the burning of Market Street, Chinatown, 34 Chinese miners were murdered by a gang of local guys, local thugs in Hell's Canyon, and their gold was taken away. The case was never, it was brought to trial, but it was just dismissed because everybody knew who the people were. They were friends, So this was not, it was in the papers in the old days, but it was just kind of dismissed. No big deal because Chinese lives were cheap. They were worthless. So Gregory Noakes, a journalist, talked to a court recorder who some years earlier, say I guess in 1970s, had found some papers in a safe about this case. And he investigated, he went to the site, and he wrote this book, and it's really very important. And it just shows that we're constantly finding things. We're constantly, discovering what really happened in those days, how the Chinese were treated, and the fact that people got away with murder and never brought to justice, and they should be remembered. They should be remembered. So we in Chinese Historical Society, when this book came out, we invited Gregory Noakes over, to Chinatown, took him out and had him speak, and just told him, thank you, this is great to do. We'll just keep spreading the word, about your book. And subsequent books have come out about hidden history of this nature. Okay, San Francisco Chinatown, District Association buildings built after the quake in 1908. These pictures I took last week. I did a walk through Chinatown with my granddaughter, Ava, who is doing a study. Her project will be on Chinese Americans. I'm very proud. These are the associations. You can see a plaque that says established, 1908, that's a district association. And now the district associations, instead of working for protecting Chinese Americans, they're keeping the culture and sort of a feeling of solidarity and keeping the culture of Chinatown too. And then on the right, this is a picture of Ava with her mask on. She's under, the Cannes restaurant has been closed for a long time. The paintings there's a big story about the paintings. It's quite an adventure. The paintings were lost after the 1980s when the original Cannes closed, but they were found, and some of us the Chinese Historical Society, led by Su Li, was able to buy 7 of them at an auction. They ended up in an auction, and then the largest one, which is on Deadwood, was found, it was found in an auto repair shop. It was owned by, it was there for safekeeping, actually, by a former waiter who's now working in the auto business, a former waiter at Cannes. And he just said, please take it. It's been in my shop for 40 years. Kind of scary. So, okay. And this is another view. If you go to Chinatown now, it's really wonderful. I just felt there's a lot of the old site still there, the feeling of the place, the feeling of the culture, and the old buildings are still there, and the like the gongso, and I must say that this is Ross Alley. It looked really clean. And this is a painting by Jake Lee. It's Lion Dance. It's actually celebrating Chinese New Year. And it's a wonderful, exuberant scene. Courtesy, here it is, CHSA. And the original paintings, all 12 are now on Clay Street, 965 Clay Street at the Chinese Historical Society. And to carry on this culture, this tradition, I want to speak more about the tradition, but another time, and you could, look it up yourselves. But the lion dance, of course, is so traditional, and it was performed in 1850 for the first parade, I guess, for statehood. The Chinese participated in their clothing and festive clothing in the lion dance. So here they are opening the ceremony, dedicating the monument to detained Chinese immigrants on Angel Island, April 28th, 1979. And you know how important the barracks are, you know, that have the poems of the Chinese immigrants, and the fact that this is a site between 1910 and 1940, where thousands of Chinese came through and so many were detained. And, you know, it symbolizes the struggle of their immigration. So here's what the poem says. And the translation in English, which I rendered, I was part of the committee rendering this poem into English. Leaving their homes and villages, they crossed the ocean only to endure confinements in these barracks. Conquering frontiers and barriers, they pioneered a new life by the Golden Gate. It was written by Nok Pi Chin, a former detainee. So this concludes my talk. I'm so happy to be here and to talk to you. I see your faces and I feel the vibes from my friends and people on Zoom. So it's been a golden experience. So, thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Connie. Wow, we've learned so much tonight, and the learning continues. So we're going to go ahead and jump straight into the Q&A portion of the event. So first, we'll take a question from the audience. If anyone has any questions. No questions. Don't be shy. Don't be shy. Yes, Jamil.
Hi, my name is Neil, and I thoroughly enjoyed the presentation. I gathered that most of the Chinese migrants when they came in from Canton.
Yes.
I'm just wondering about that, and you say that the villagers, the small villages on that, and when they came in, that how educated they were, they knew the English language, that how educated they were, and when they survived here, made it, and when the change came over, they thought, aha, we should get more our kids educated and all that, and I turned.
I think the thing was, how could they have a family? How could they possibly have a family? I mean, the workers, when they came, they knew they couldn't, just like the gold miners who came from Massachusetts, they couldn't bring their families. It's such a rough, but later the white people found they could be called settlers. But for the Chinese, there was such hostility and such danger, they couldn't bring their families over until, you know, I think the merchant class in establishing San Francisco made a big difference, and circumventing some of the laws. And the railroads, I did want to mention, was the biggest wave of Chinese immigration. And that really did lead to the Chinese exclusion law, because after the building of the railroads, there's all these Chinese workers, and they would find other work like building the levees. But there was the rise of the white labor movement, and they were just the cry, the Chinese must go, you're taking away our jobs. And then to establish that a Chinese labor could not, you know, could not go back and forth. He actually was just either, if he left, he could never come back because he's a laborer, only a merchant class or student class. And I forgot to mention that I think the primary thing in preventing the Chinese from settling is the Chinese exclusion law clause, which said Chinese are to be prohibited from naturalization to US citizenship. So they couldn't be citizens, so why would they come here? You know, why? I mean, what hope could they have of having their children? Well, of course, the children would be born here, but there'd be that still that feeling of perpetual foreigner. And when the Chinese exclusion law, I mean, it lasted for what, 43 years. During that whole period of time, our history, our narrative was excluded. I mean, all our achievements are not American, just like the railroad, you know. I mean, when John Volpe, you know, for the 100th anniversary, he made this speech, who but Americans could have built 10 miles of track in one day? Who but Americans could have tunneled through, you know, made 10 tunnels through the Sierras? So it's that idea of being an American. And as far as the literacy, you know, I just knew this from my grandfather, who came at the age of 11, and he later became a revolutionary leader, you know, follower of Sun Yat-sen. And he loved books. He read and read and read. He just loved, and he wrote speeches and everything. And all of this was from his, I guess, third or fourth grade, you know, 3 years in the village school. But he kept on learning. He had the basics. So, but I do know that not all of people were literate, because my grandfather came because he was inspired by his uncle, who came first, but his uncle was, you know, talked about gold mining and all this stuff, but he never made his living there because he was a letter writer. He came in his 40s. He led the Taiping Rebellion. So he was a literate man. So he became a letter writer. And the fact that he made money, a little bit of money, being a letter writer, I mean, for people who weren't educated. So, you know, it's not all the way across the board, but enough of them were. So thanks for, yeah.
Okay, so I apologize.
Oh,
I
yes.
I missed out on our Zoom audience here. So if I can actually have you repeat the question from our Zoom audience, that'd be great. The next question. So I'll go ahead and take
Okay.
this.
There's one there.
Oh,
Okay.
okay, great.
I have a question. Is there any record of how many people who came from China actually gave up and went back, or were they able to do that?
Yes, there's really no record, except for the census would say, oh, after the 1890s, the Chinatown, it went from like 30,000 people to 10,000 people or something. A lot of the Chinese railroad workers, I think the chance to stay and make $1 a day was just, you know, a great draw. But then they realized they needed to go home. They had to have their families. So there's no record, I'm sorry. But I would say after the Exclusion Act, and particularly, after the Exclusion Act and then the Geary Act, when Chinese all had to register, they knew they had no hope. And I interviewed, you know, when I first started writing about the Chinese, I'm talking about the 1960s, I interviewed a lot of people who were white, who had farms, you know, and they had pictures of their favorite Chinaman, you know, and they would say, oh, there's one woman, she said, he actually, you know, he was so loved in the family that he even babysat for her, you know, it's just like so trusted. And then when he got very old, he went back to China to die. That was the phrase, they'd go back to China to die. These were single men. And of course, there was that belief that even for the railroad, in the contract for the railroad workers, you know, if they died on the job, they would be, their bones would be sent back to China, you know. And so that there's, you know, the feeling that was their home. It would have been different during the gold rush if instead of the foreign miners tax, there'd just be no tax and they could be citizens and pay normal income tax, you know, but okay.
So I guess we'll take one question from the Zoom audience.
Okay.
And then if you could just repeat it back into
Okay.
the mic so we can make sure our Zoom audience hears as well. And the question is, what religious beliefs and practices did the Chinese bring over with them in the 1800s?
What religious practices did the Chinese bring over when they came over in the 1850s? The Chinese certainly brought over their customs and their religion. I mean, the religion's very, I shouldn't say, well, it wasn't very strict. There's no congregation, which is very convenient, you know, but the Chinese had to have temples. When you go in the gold country, well, maybe not now, but I would hope that some of the temples are still there. So I visited the Weaverville Temple, and there's one in Oroville. There's everywhere there was Chinese, there'd be a temple. And the religion is this, it's a combination, if you look at the temples, of Taoism, folklore, folk religion, and Buddhism. And so, and Confucian principles. So they brought it was very in their hearts, my goodness. I don't think there was much preaching going on. And so this was a really a big challenge for them because they realized they'd be accepted if they became Christians. Because, you know, a lot of the religious people argued that, okay, if the Chinese are being attacked, you know, if it'd be different if they be Christians, then they'd be protected. So, okay, in Chinatown, Heinleinville, which I know best because my father was born there, he went to Sunday school, but he also went to the temple. The temple was in the town, and that's what he really believed, you know. But he went to the Chinese Methodist Episcopal Church. So, but anyway, they brought their religion, they brought their customs. In fact, the lion dances would be part of their religion, the idea of chasing away evil spirits. And then there are holidays that are still observed here, you know, like the Qingming, where, you know, there's paying respects to the departed. And then there's Daju, the summer festival, you know, and I shouldn't say festival, it's a holiday. And if you read my book, Chinatown, San Jose, USA, I have 3 pictures of the procession from Daju, the Feast of the Hungry Ghost. And my father said it was just fantastic. The kids enjoyed it so much, and they actually thought that they were seeing the spirits take the offerings. And so it's practiced like a folk culture. It's not like, you know, the Catholic Church, you know, going to confession, you have to go to mass and all these. No, you don't have to do anything. Oh, except pay respects to the departed and a few other things. And Chinese New Year, you have to have jai and you have to have certain foods. But let's say, how do you say this kind of religion? I would say it's a people's religion, and it was not, there weren't formal doctrines, you know. But there certainly were formal rituals that the Taoist priests, for instance, maybe after the gold rush, you know, you'd have Taoist priests come over, you know, people who would practice Taoism, who know how to lead people for certain rituals. So anyway, I certainly have enjoyed their festivals, and I feel that the traditions have been carried on because of this folk religion.
So we'll go ahead and alternate questions. Does anyone have a question?
Thanks for your talk. I had a question, out of curiosity. There was a series started by Bruce Lee that made it to TV called Warrior. HBO or Cinemax, and brought my awareness to these Chinatown tongs and the Tong Wars. I was just curious if you have any insight to share about the history of that struggle that happened there with the parts of the city.
Yes, this is a question about Tong Wars, and that have been portrayed in, you know, a lot of movies and martial art movies. The word Tong is actually hall or organization, you know, like Hazing Tong is what the district association that my family, my father's side, belonged to. And it's a benevolent association. But then we would heard about gambling tongs and tongs that dealt in prostitution. There were, you know, that they would be the you know, the criminal tongs. And there would be feuds between gambling tongs, and that was absolutely true over territory. And that happened, actually that happened in some of the local Chinatowns here, certainly in San Jose in the 1920s. There would be feuds between tongs, and they would come into the towns. I mean, there weren't any tongs in Heinleinville, but, you know, the tongs would come through, you know, fighting over territory for gambling or something. But they certainly existed, and there were wars, and I wouldn't say wars, they're battles. And so I would say it's certainly true. That was a criminal aspect, and it really was very upsetting to the Chinese community, certainly to the Chinese 6 companies that tried to settle some of these disputes. But I think what I think was, to me, most egregious were the tongs that dealt in prostitution as well as gambling. You know, they did terrible things. And I would like to add one thing about the earthquake in 1906. You know, they never mentioned the numbers of Chinese who died. And the numbers were very low because for the overall, because San Francisco was trying to promote its city again and didn't want to show that it had such a horrible disaster. But my mother told me that what was really forgotten was the women, the prostituted young girls who were trapped, you know, in the underground basements, who probably didn't get out. She said, nobody would ever know, but it happened. She said she knows, she felt that it happened. I guess she heard that from her mother. And it's a terrible story. So anyway, I blame that Tong, or that certain Tong that got started that.
So we do have a question from Zoom. Do Cantonese still refer to America as Gold Mountain, or was it replaced by beautiful country?
Do the Cantonese still refer to America as Gamsan, or is it replaced by beautiful country, Meiko? Well, if you go to Chinese school, you know, Cantonese, you have to say Meiko, you have to write down. But colloquially, we still say Gamsan. And it's in the buildings, you know, it's in the logo, it's in the culture. This is so strong in our culture, you know. Nele, Gamsan Gay Noi, you know, how long have you been, you know, long time California. So I would say maybe more recent, the younger Cantonese would say Meiko, you know, yes.
I remember my mother-in-law always referred to Gaogamsan, meaning San Francisco. So which translates into old mountain.
Yes, so Diana asked this, has this comment that was it your mother?
My mother-in-law.
Your mother-in-law referred to, you know, use the term Gao Gamsan. Gao Gamsan means old gold mountain. And you know what Sun Gamsan was? Australia. I mean, yeah, because when gold was discovered in Australia, some Chinese went there. So that's kind of usurped it. But yeah, but I've never, you know, in our family, we didn't talk about Gao Gamsan because I guess because my father was so involved with Chinatown and he wanted the Gamsan room in Cairns, you know, so we kept that. Yes.
So I came from a Mandarin speaking family. So my family still calls San Francisco Jiushan. But then the Cantonese people now call it Sanfan. So how did it go from Gold Mountain to just call it San Francisco, like San Fran?
San Francisco. I think after the earthquake, Chinatown also was battling for a really good image. And they were going to say, you know, San Francisco, San Francisco, we're part of San Francisco. And I was told that was a polite thing to say. That if,
So
can you imagine? Yes.
Cantonese people now that live in the city don't call it, but then why is it that the Mandarin people still call it Jiushan and then the Cantonese people call it? So I always have to.
Yeah, well, I like that. I mean, I like to know, to hear that that's in Mandarin, you use the Gamsan too. That's great. Well, I think it depends on maybe the particular culture of your family and the business that you're in. Like my father was a soy sauce manufacturer and invested in the restaurants, and he was in the Chinese Chamber of Commerce. And of course, he wanted to remember that old culture. So the Gamsan and all of our relatives use that. But then when we talk to, you know, when diplomats came by, we'd say San Francisco. So, hi, Larry.
I can solve the problem. If you're from Taiwan, if you read Taiwanese newspaper, and then you would call Genshan Old Gold Mountain. If you read the paper like Xingdao, or Cantonese version of it, Genshan, if you read it, the old Gold Mountain paper from Chinatown, definitely they say Canton. So the reason why there's many dialects in China, even Canton alone, there's 20, 30 different dialects. Everybody speaks differently. So based on the newspaper you read about it, and the use, if you use Sekai World Journal right now, 旧金山, so if you use 青岛日报, 金山, so we get used to it, because I speak both Cantonese, Mandarin, and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So all, I think it's which paper you read.
Right. but I
Oh,
think
thank you,
like
Chef
that.
Chu, for that. That was so clearly done.
I'm right here. I've been around for 50 years. 51 years. I live in almost 60. I knew whatever he says, beautiful, especially when he mentioned Ken's restaurant. It is one of the best. My brother used to work there as a busboy while I was in Hong Kong. So he said, I'm working and as a busboy. I thought you were working a bus. The best Chinese restaurant in San Francisco on Greenwich Avenue in the second floor. That was a beautiful restaurant.
Oh, thank you, Lawrence Chu. That was so, I like the story about all the newspapers, your comment.
You
Yeah.
read it.
Yeah.
All right, so we'll take one final question from Zoom and then we'll have to conclude the evening. And the final question is, immigrants from which other East Asian countries were in California during the 1800s? And were they lumped in with the Chinese or treated differently?
Which, were there immigrants from other East Asian countries that came in the 1850s?
1800s.
1800s. Oh, I would say Japanese did come in, but they first came in, noticeable numbers would be 1890. When I read newspapers from the 1800s, the way they described Asians, I don't think they really knew where they came from. One was a Tartar. A Tartar came into the town. What's a Tartar? And then another would be a Mongol from Mongolia, and that's it. And then, Kanakas, they always talk about Kanakas from Hawaii. But East Asian countries, I think that I can just safely say 1890s, Japanese came in numbers, and they decided to settle in California.
Great, thank you so much.
One more audience question?
Oh,
Or-
Yes.
That was wonderful, thank you. I wanted to know, you mentioned the 6 companies. How far did their reach extend as far as California or the rest of the?
Oh, how far did what was the power of the Chinese 6 companies? It was very powerful. It was throughout the United States. In fact, they have branches everywhere, representatives everywhere. And when they were suing in court, I mean, I think they had representatives from New York. They were certainly in Baltimore. I have relatives who were in Baltimore and New York, and with connections to the 6 companies. And the 6 companies, I visited the headquarters last week. I couldn't believe it. I walked in there, and there it is with all it looked like 1890s. But right now it's more of a cultural organization, and they have a rotating presidency, so that, and it's a very good idea. They always rotate it so that no one district could take power, but it's every 2 months. And in municipalities, how can you get any work done? But anyway, I think they all agreed, but it was far reaching. The Chinese 6 companies was the civic body for Chinese in America. Mhm.
Have one quick. You might see, first time I heard about that fire in Chinese Chinatown in San Jose. Do you see any similarities between that one and later up in Black Wall Street in Tokyo?
About the fires?
Korea fire?
Oh, yes. Well, Chinatown's, it's interesting. I mean, it's very sad that after the Chinese exclusion law, there were more and more fires and more driving out of the Chinese. Every single Chinatown, every single community that had Chinese had some form of expulsion And I don't know if you've heard of the truckee method where they decided instead of driving them out, they'll just starve them out. So nobody could buy anything from their stores. And it's called the truckee method. Tacoma, Washington, I particularly find horrible. You know, I mean, they drove the Chinese out in 1886, and they drove them out in a pouring rainstorm, just all of them. And some couple of Chinese died of the heart. They just walking, you know, women with bound feet, you know, just drove them out, And then they went to Seattle, you know, and then Seattle was driving them out. They could take the ship back to DIFO, San Francisco. The first time the National Guard has ever been called to Washington State was over the Seattle riots, driving out the Chinese. In San Jose, well, we have a positive story on San Jose because the Chinese would not be driven out. The new Chinatown could be built, and you will see a lot more of this history unveiled, and because there's the site of the Highlandville Chinatown is in Japantown. You could see, if you go there now, there's this huge complex of buildings going up. And there will be a park that's called Highlandville Park, named after John Heinlein, who leased land to the Chinese so they wouldn't be driven out, they could have a home. So I'm part of the history committee for the park. So I'll report back to you. Thank you so much.
I think all of you can see why we consider it a great honor that Connie is a member of the museum. It's just, thank you so much for sharing that personal story. We had wonderful comments on Zoom. Everyone was really so grateful. There was a lot of dialogue, and maybe Connie will have a chance to look at some of those other questions too. But I know that Eleanor has made some tea, I believe, Eleanor, right? It's not coffee, right? It must be tea. Okay. And she made us some, even though it's COVID time, if you're not comfortable, that's fine. I will raise the curtains. The doors are open if you want to step outside, but I do believe that Eleanor made her attempt at almond cookies. So I want to make sure you get a chance for some hospitality. I also wanted to acknowledge, we have some board members here with us tonight, which I really appreciate the service of our board members, Alex Wang, Wayne Hooper, our board president, Gary Hedden. So if you're not familiar with the museum, please take an opportunity to say hello to our board members. We are honored that Chef Chu is with us this evening too. Thank you so much for being here. And we had a record-breaking attendance for this. We had over 100 people on Zoom and this room full. So you can tell just what well, Connie, everyone was really interested in everything you had to say. And thank you again so much for being here this evening. Thank you all on Zoom too, okay? We'll talk to you later.